James Harper had always prided himself on the foundation upon which FreshFields Market was built. What began as a single store in a quiet suburban neighborhood had expanded into a successful chain now spread across the entire region. The brand, known for its commitment to high-quality products and customer service, had a reputation that James had nurtured for over a decade. But recently, something felt off. The company's growth was still strong, but internally there were whispers of discontent, complaints about poor customer service, long wait times, and rude employees had been rising steadily. However, it wasn't until reports started coming in about the mistreatment of elderly customers that James knew he had to take action. For years, James had relied on reports and the insights from his managers to understand what was happening inside his stores. He trusted the numbers, the metrics, and the feedback provided by his management team, believing it gave him a clear picture of how his stores were performing. But the more he read, the more he realized that these reports didn't tell the whole story. The problems weren't just about bottom-line figures or sales targets, they were about people. The customers who walked through his doors, the employees who served them, and the culture that had once made FreshFields Market a beloved community staple. That's when the decision was made. James had no intention of being one of those COs who only ever saw the surface. He knew that if he wanted to uncover the truth, he couldn't just rely on second-hand reports. The time had come for him to get his hands dirty and see firsthand what was happening inside his stores. So, with a mix of anticipation and concern, James decided to go undercover. He would disguise himself as a cashier, work alongside his employees, and listen to what was really going on behind the scenes. It was the only way he could truly understand if the complaints were justified or if there was something deeper at play. The first step was changing his appearance. James had always been a sharp dresser, known for his impeccable suits and clean-cut look, but for his undercover mission he would need to blend in. He shaved off his well-groomed beard, swapped his tailored suits for a plain polo shirt and khakis, and donned thick-rimmed glasses to complete the look. To his employees, he would be just another cashier, someone they wouldn't recognize. He also gave himself the name Eric, a simple, nondescript alias that would make it easier for him to stay unnoticed. Choosing the right location to start his mission was critical. James needed to see a store that was truly struggling, a place where the issues weren't just rumors or isolated incidents. He selected one of his worst-performing locations, an average-sized store in a suburban neighborhood. This was a store that had been receiving complaints about long lines, unhelpful employees, and a general lack of customer service. The store manager, John Mitchell, had been with the company for years, but complaints about his leadership were growing. Many employees had voiced concerns about John's approach, his treatment of both customers and staff, and the overall atmosphere he fostered. It was clear that James needed to see for himself what was happening there. On his first day, James was introduced to Sarah Lawson, the assistant manager, who was already juggling multiple tasks. She showed him around the store, explaining some of the basics. Though she was kind, there was a noticeable fatigue in her voice, a weariness that spoke volumes. As they moved through the aisles, she mentioned something that caught his attention. "The registers freeze sometimes, so just be patient," she said. Then, as if reluctantly, she added, "And if you hear John say something, just ignore him." It was the kind of offhand remark that James couldn't ignore. Something wasn't right here, and he could feel it in the air. As James spent the next few hours ringing up customers, he couldn't help but notice how tense the environment was. Most customers were polite, but a few seemed irritated by the long waits, and the employees were visibly on edge. They glanced nervously at John's office, a place that seemed to loom over them. Every time John walked through the store, there was a noticeable shift in the energy. Employees stiffened, their smiles faltered, and their movements became hurried. The fear was palpable, and it wasn't long before James understood why. John Mitchell, the store manager, was a stocky man with a permanent scowl. He stomped through the aisles, barking orders, his eyes narrowing as he observed the employees from afar. When an elderly woman approached the register with a small basket of groceries, James could see the tension in her every step. She moved slowly, carefully placing each item on the conveyor belt. The moment she did, John let out an exaggerated sigh, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. "Here we go again," he muttered, loud enough for James to hear. "These old folks take forever. They count their pennies, ask dumb questions, and then hold up the line. I swear they should have their own damn store." James was appalled. The woman, clearly embarrassed by the comment, fumbled with her purse, her hands trembling as she apologized. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I just need a moment." John's response was a mockingly sweet, "Take your time, ma'am," but the sarcasm was thick, and James could see it. The woman looked mortified, and James felt a pang of anger well up inside him. He quickly finished ringing up her groceries, gently placing them in her cart. "Take your time, ma'am. No rush at all," he said sincerely, hoping to offer some comfort. The woman smiled gratefully at him before shuffling away. James's mind raced as he watched John's behavior unfold. This wasn't just about a single rude incident. This was a pattern. John's attitude toward elderly customers was just the tip of the iceberg. As James observed more of the store's operations, he realized how deeply rooted the issues were. It wasn't just about the customers. It was about how John treated his employees, too. The store's atmosphere was tense, and employees were working under constant pressure. James knew he had to dig deeper if he was going to get to the heart of the problem. What he had witnessed so far was just the beginning. The decision was made. James Harper had always believed in leading by example, but the time had come to see firsthand what was happening in his stores. His instincts told him that something was wrong, but the reports he had been receiving never fully captured the gravity of the situation. The only way to truly understand the challenges within his company, and especially the complaints about customer service, was to step into the shoes of his employees. To do that, James knew he needed to go undercover. He needed to blend in completely, to see the reality of the day-to-day operations, and most importantly, to find out if his suspicions were valid. He wasn't just going to show up and observe from the top. He was going to work the floor like any other employee. The first step was changing his appearance. James was no stranger to sharp suits and well-maintained grooming. As the CEO of FreshFields Market, his appearance was always impeccable. Tailored suits, neatly combed hair, and a neatly trimmed beard. But for this mission, he needed to completely shed his usual persona. He shaved off his beard, opting for a rough stubble that would make him less recognizable. His once polished appearance was replaced by something far more inconspicuous: a simple polo shirt, khakis, and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. To the employees, he would be Eric, a name that was ordinary enough to make him blend into the background, just another cashier working alongside them. James wasn't just choosing any store to work at. He specifically selected the worst-performing location in the entire chain. This was a store that had been plagued with issues, rising complaints about long lines, rude staff, and a general feeling of dissatisfaction among customers. For James, this was the perfect place to start. He needed to witness the dynamics between employees and customers in a location where the problems had already become evident. It was crucial for him to see the issues up close without the filters of management reports or customer surveys. By working here, James would not only get a sense of what the problems were, but also begin to understand the root causes that had led to such a decline in service. The store James chose was located in a suburban neighborhood, a mid-sized location that had been struggling for months. The complaints about long wait times were constant, but what stood out most to James were the whispers of dissatisfaction about the store manager, John Mitchell. John had been with the company for years, but his reputation for poor leadership had spread throughout the store. James had received multiple reports from employees about John's management style, and none of them painted a flattering picture. Many employees claimed John ran the store with a heavy hand, using fear and intimidation rather than motivation and guidance. His leadership style was not one of inspiration, but of constant criticism and micromanagement. James knew this was the part of the store's culture that needed the most attention. As soon as James arrived at the store, he could feel the tension in the air. The energy was different from the other FreshFields locations he had visited. There was an undercurrent of unease that was hard to ignore. The staff moved quickly but with no real sense of purpose. They seemed to be going through the motions, and every employee appeared to be on edge, glancing nervously at the store manager's office. James wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the sense of fear and discomfort in the air was more intense than he had anticipated. This was not a team that felt supported or valued. Instead, it was a group of employees who were simply trying to get through the day without drawing attention to themselves or risking John's wrath. James's first task was to get into the rhythm of the workday. He stood behind the register and began ringing up customers. At first, everything seemed fine. Most customers were polite, though a few seemed frustrated by the slow service. It was when John Mitchell first appeared that the atmosphere changed. John stormed through the store with his signature scowl, barking orders and glaring at employees. James watched him from the corner of his eye as he moved to hover near the registers. John's presence was like a dark cloud over the store. Employees flinched when he walked by, and there was a noticeable shift in their demeanor. It was clear that John's leadership was having a direct impact on the team's morale. It didn't take long for James to witness John's behavior firsthand. An elderly woman approached the counter with a small basket of groceries, moving slowly as she carefully placed each item on the conveyor belt. James noticed her trembling hands and the hesitation in her voice as she apologized for taking her time. That's when John spoke up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Here we go again," he muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "See, does old folks take forever? They count their pennies, ask dumb questions, and then hold up the line. I swear they should have their own damn store." James was appalled. The woman looked embarrassed, fumbling with her purse as she apologized again, her face reddening with shame. James's heart went out to her. He quickly finished ringing her up and made sure to speak to her kindly. "Take your time, ma'am. No rush at all," he said gently, offering her a comforting smile. The woman's eyes brightened, and she gave him a small nod of gratitude as she shuffled away. As the day went on, James continued to observe the store's operations. It became clear that John's toxic leadership was affecting more than just customer interactions. Employees were visibly stressed, with many trying to avoid John's gaze. There were constant whispers in the break room about how John treated certain workers, giving preferential treatment to some while berating others. James saw how the schedules seemed deliberately unfair, with certain employees receiving inconsistent hours while others, particularly those who were older or quieter, were given the worst shifts. It was clear that John had created a culture of fear and favoritism that had poisoned the store's atmosphere. The more James watched, the more it became apparent that the problems at this store were deeper than just poor customer service. They were systemic issues that stemmed from bad leadership. By the end of the day, James knew he had to make a change. The environment was toxic, and it wasn't just the customers who were suffering, it was the employees as well. What he had witnessed was not an isolated incident. John Mitchell's leadership style had permeated every aspect of the store's operations, from the way customers were treated to the way employees were managed. James was now more determined than ever to make a difference. He couldn't allow this kind of behavior to continue under his watch, and he knew that it was time to take action. But first, he needed to see just how deep the problems ran and how he could best address them. As the day wore on, James Harper's unease grew. What he had initially thought were rumors of poor customer service and toxic leadership at FreshFields Market quickly revealed themselves to be more than just whispers. The deeper he observed the store's operations, the more he could see the damaging impact of John Mitchell's leadership style. James had expected to see some mismanagement, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of cruelty and disregard for both employees and customers. It didn't take long before James became acutely aware of just how much of an influence John's toxic behavior had on the entire store's atmosphere. It all began when James witnessed John's treatment of an elderly customer. She had carefully placed her groceries on the conveyor belt and was moving slowly, as elderly customers often do. James watched her hands tremble as she counted out the change from her purse, doing her best to avoid holding up the line. It was a simple, human moment, the kind that any compassionate person would understand. But John Mitchell, who was standing nearby, didn't see it that way. With a loud sigh, he rolled his eyes and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Here we go again. These old folks take forever. They count every penny, ask stupid questions, and hold up the line. They should have their own store." His words were dripping with contempt, and they weren't directed at the woman alone. They were an open mockery of her age and patience. The elderly customer, clearly embarrassed by the comment, fumbled nervously with her purse, her face reddening as she apologized for taking longer than she wanted. "I'm sorry, I just need a moment," she murmured, her voice quiet and apologetic. Instead of responding with kindness, as any decent person would, John smirked and gave her a forced smile. "Take your time, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. As he stepped away from the register, he muttered under his breath, "Not like anyone else has somewhere to be." James watched the elderly woman's shoulders slump in embarrassment, her eyes welling up with tears as she quickly gathered her things and hurried out of the store. The entire interaction left a pit in James's stomach. He had heard complaints about John's behavior, but seeing it firsthand was an entirely different experience. As the day progressed, James continued to watch John's interactions with the employees, and it quickly became clear that his toxic attitude was not limited to customers. It was a systemic problem, affecting both the morale of the staff and the overall work environment. Employees seemed on edge, constantly glancing over their shoulders, waiting for John to appear and issue one of his many scathing criticisms. James could see how his presence alone created an atmosphere of fear and discomfort. It wasn't just that John's leadership was harsh, it was cruel and demoralizing. His management style was based entirely on intimidation, with little regard for the well-being or opinions of his team. One person who seemed to be bearing the brunt of this was Sarah Lawson, the assistant manager. Sarah was a hard-working woman, clearly dedicated to her job, but James could see how much she was struggling. She was constantly running from task to task, filling in for missing staff, and managing customer complaints without ever getting a break. Sarah was overworked, but it was more than that. She was underappreciated, and worst of all, mistreated by John. James observed Sarah as she moved through the store, her face drawn with exhaustion, yet always managing to keep up the appearance of being in control. But it was clear from the way she interacted with John that she was afraid of him. Every time he spoke to her, there was a visible tension in her posture, a nervousness in her voice. It was as if she was constantly walking on eggshells, never quite sure when the next harsh word or public humiliation would come. James watched one particular exchange between Sarah and John that was nothing short of painful. As Sarah hurried to manage multiple tasks at once, John stood in the doorway of his office, arms crossed, watching her closely. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" John snapped as Sarah walked past. "You're not paid to run around like a damn headless chicken. You're supposed to manage, so do your job." Sarah's face turned red, and James could see the frustration in her eyes. She pressed her lips together, nodding silently, and then quickly walked away without responding. As Sarah passed by, she muttered under her breath, "I'm just trying to keep this place together." It was a heartbreaking moment for James to witness, as Sarah had clearly been pushed to her limits. She was doing the work of several people, covering for missing employees. Yet, she was being treated like an incompetent fool by John. The more James observed, the more it became evident that John's behavior wasn't just a few isolated outbursts. This was the way he ran the entire store, through fear, sarcasm, and complete disregard for the dignity of others. Sarah's exhaustion and fear were just one example of the damage that John had caused. Other employees were also walking on eggshells, afraid to speak up or challenge him. They were treated as expendable, as if their only value was in getting the job done without complaint. James could see how much the team had been demoralized. They weren't motivated by respect or a desire to succeed. They were merely surviving, doing their best to avoid drawing attention from John. This toxic atmosphere was not just hurting the employees, it was damaging the entire store's culture and, by extension, the company as a whole. James knew something had to change, and it had to happen quickly. He had witnessed enough to understand that John Mitchell's leadership style was the root of the store's problems. The lack of respect for customers, the fear among employees, and the constant mistreatment of staff were symptoms of a much larger issue: poor leadership. The culture of FreshFields Market had been built on respect, kindness, and customer service, but John had stripped it all away. What was once a thriving store had now become a place of fear and hostility. James knew that he couldn't let this go on any longer. It was time to make a change, not just for the sake of the employees, but for the future of the company itself. The question was, what would he do next? How could he bring the store back from the brink of collapse? James wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't allow John Mitchell to continue running this store any longer. James Harper had spent most of the day observing, carefully taking in the dynamics of the store. The longer he worked undercover, the clearer it became that the issues at FreshFields Market went much deeper than he had initially thought. The toxic environment that had been created under John Mitchell's leadership was not just about a few isolated incidents. It was a pervasive culture of fear, intimidation, and resentment that had settled over the entire store. However, it wasn't until James overheard a conversation in the break room that he truly grasped the full extent of the damage. What he heard made his blood boil, but it also confirmed the suspicions that had been growing in his mind since he first set foot in the store. It was during a quiet moment in the break room, where the employees had gathered for a brief respite from their duties. James, sitting in the corner, pretended to scroll through his phone, trying to keep a low profile. He didn't expect anything remarkable to happen, but the conversation he overheard between two cashiers changed everything. One of the cashiers, a young woman named Emily, was speaking in a hushed tone to another employee. James couldn't make out all the details, but the frustration in her voice was palpable. "Can you believe he cut my hours again?" she asked, shaking her head in disbelief. "I can't keep doing this. I'm already barely making enough as it is, and now he's slashing my shifts." Meanwhile, some of the others, those who kiss up to him, are getting full-time hours without any problem. The other cashier, a man named David, nodded sympathetically. "It's the same for me. Every time I try to speak up, John gives me less hours, or worse, he'll make passive-aggressive comments about my performance. I've been working here for 3 years, and I still can't get a consistent schedule. It's not just us either. He's doing it to others too." Emily sighed deeply, clearly frustrated and demoralized. "And don't even get me started on how he treats the customers. It's like he doesn't care about anything but his own ego. I've seen him make customers wait for no reason just because he's in a bad mood. And the older customers? Forget it. They're invisible to him. It's like he has no respect for anyone except himself." James clenched his fists, trying to contain his anger. This conversation only confirmed what he had witnessed with his own eyes, the blatant disrespect, not just for the customers but for the employees as well. It was clear that John had no regard for fairness or kindness. He had created an environment where favoritism and fear ruled, where employees were punished for speaking up and praised only if they met his arbitrary standards. What was worse, the employees felt trapped. They were stuck in a toxic environment with no way out. They couldn't even rely on each other for support, because they knew that speaking out could have serious consequences. The deeper James listened, the more he understood just how suffocating the work environment had become. Emily continued, her voice low but steady. "It's like we're all just supposed to take it. Nobody dares to say anything because if you do, John will find a way to make your life miserable. You're either in his good graces or you're out. And let's be honest, none of us want to be the next target." "It's exhausting." David shook his head. "You're right. I've been trying to find another job, but it's hard. It feels like all the decent places are just as bad and no one wants to hire someone who's been stuck in this mess for so long." Emily nodded grimly. "Exactly. We're stuck. We have no choice but to just keep our heads down and hope things get better, but they never do." James felt a deep sense of responsibility as he listened to their conversation. He had built FreshFields Market with a sense of purpose and community in mind. He wanted his stores to be a place where both employees and customers felt valued, where respect was the foundation of every interaction. But what he was hearing in that break room was a far cry from that vision. The employees weren't just frustrated. They were living in fear. Fear of John's unpredictable temper, fear of losing their hours or being unfairly punished, fear of simply doing the right thing and speaking out. It was an environment where morale was at rock bottom, and the fear of retaliation kept everyone silent. As James continued to listen, he couldn't help but notice how the other employees in the room seemed to shrink away from the conversation. They were afraid to get involved, afraid that even being associated with a complaint could lead to consequences. The silence in the break room was deafening, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the conversation to end. James realized that this was the heart of the problem. The culture of fear that John had created. No one felt safe enough to speak up, and as a result, the store had become a place where problems were swept under the rug, where toxic behavior was allowed to fester and spread. It wasn't just the employees who were suffering. The customers were too. James had seen the way John treated them, particularly the elderly customers, with complete disdain. But it wasn't just about bad customer service. It was about how John's behavior had created a ripple effect throughout the entire store. The employees, who were already on edge, were unable to give their best because they feared the repercussions of making mistakes or standing up for themselves. They were walking on eggshells, doing the bare minimum just to get by, and it showed in their interactions with customers. The store's reputation had taken a serious hit, and it was clear that something needed to change. And fast. James couldn't let this go on any longer. He had spent enough time observing, enough time hearing the stories of frustrated and fearful employees. He had seen the toll that John's leadership had taken on the morale of the staff, and he knew that it wasn't just about fixing a few isolated issues. It was about changing the culture of the store entirely. It was time to step in and make some hard decisions, but before he could do anything, he needed to take action. The employees had been waiting for someone to take charge, to stand up for them, and James knew he was the one who had to lead the charge. It was time to confront the toxic behavior head-on, and he wouldn't let fear stand in the way. James Harper had spent hours carefully observing the inner workings of his store. The more time he spent undercover, the clearer it became that the problems at FreshFields Market were not just surface-level issues. What he had witnessed, the disdainful treatment of elderly customers, the harsh leadership, and the pervasive fear among employees, was far deeper than he had imagined. It wasn't just poor management. It was a toxic environment that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Every interaction James had witnessed, every whispered conversation he had overheard, pointed to one undeniable conclusion. John Mitchell had to go. The decision was heavy, but James knew it was necessary. His company had been built on respect, on creating a space where both employees and customers felt valued. But under John's leadership, that vision had been completely undermined. James had watched as John ridiculed customers, berated his employees, and created a culture of fear and resentment. The employees who had once been passionate about their work were now beaten down, doing the bare minimum to survive. James had promised himself that FreshFields Market would always be a place of community and respect. The time for tolerating John's toxic leadership was over. As James sat quietly behind the register, his mind raced. The more he thought about the situation, the more he realized that this was about more than just one bad manager. This was about the culture of the entire store, and if left unchecked, it could spread to other locations as well. John's behavior had been allowed to go on unchecked for too long, and now it was time for James to step in. No longer could he stand by and pretend everything was fine. The employees needed leadership, and the customers deserved better. James knew that if he was going to be the CEO his company needed, he had to take swift and decisive action. That afternoon, James made his way to John's office. He had already made up his mind. He would no longer remain an anonymous observer. It was time to confront John, to reveal his true identity and to show the employees that he would not tolerate this kind of behavior. As James walked into the manager's office, he could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had heard so many stories, so many complaints, but this moment felt different. This was the moment when the change would begin. John looked up from his desk, surprised to see James standing there. His eyes widened, and for a brief moment, he seemed to hesitate. "What are you doing here, kid?" John asked, his tone condescending. James didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly removed his glasses and pulled off his name tag, setting it down on John's desk. The room fell into a heavy silence as John's eyes scanned the name tag, the realization slowly dawning on him. "I'm James Harper," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm the CEO of FreshFields Market, and I've been working here undercover for the past few days." John's face drained of color as the words sank in. "You, what?" he stammered, unable to hide the shock and disbelief. But James wasn't done. He had seen enough, and now it was time to put an end to John's reign. "I've watched you, John. I've seen how you treat customers, how you treat your employees, the way you mock the elderly, the way you bully your staff, the way you create an environment where people are too afraid to speak up. That stops today." James's words were calm, but they carried an authority that left no room for argument. John opened his mouth to protest, but James cut him off. "You're fired, John. Effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, John was speechless. He looked as though he was trying to process what had just happened, his mind racing for an explanation, a defense. But there was no defense. His behavior had been appalling, and now he would face the consequences. James didn't need to say anything else. The decision had been made. John stood up slowly, his face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to say something, but James was already speaking. "Get your things and leave. Your time here is over." The tension in the room was palpable. John shot a bitter look at James before storming out of the office, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The silence that followed was almost deafening. James knew this was just the beginning of a much larger change, but for now the first step had been taken. He had removed the root cause of the toxic environment. But there was still work to do. The employees needed to know that things would change, that the store would no longer be a place of fear and mistrust. It was time to address them, to reassure them that they could finally feel safe in their workplace. As James stepped back into the main floor, he could see the uncertainty in the eyes of the employees. Some of them were already glancing around, unsure of what was happening. They had been living in fear for so long that the sudden shift in power was both unexpected and unsettling. James raised his hand, signaling for attention. "Listen up, everyone," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the store. "I know this has been a difficult time for all of you. You've been working in an environment where respect has been scarce, where fear has been the only thing keeping this place running. That ends today. John Mitchell is no longer your manager, and he won't be coming back. The toxic environment he created is over." The employees stood frozen for a moment, processing what James had said. Then slowly, one by one, they began to nod, their faces slowly changing from confusion to relief. James continued, "I want you to know that things are going to change. We're going to create a work environment based on respect, trust, and fairness. No one here should ever feel afraid to speak up or stand up for what's right. You all deserve better, and I'm going to make sure that happens." He paused, looking at the employees who had been with him through the hardest of times. "I know it won't happen overnight, but I promise you this, I'm listening now, and I won't stop until we've rebuilt this place into what it was meant to be. This is your store too, and together we're going to make it a place you can be proud of." The employees exchanged glances, and James could see the weight begin to lift from their shoulders. For the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to believe that change was possible. James knew it would take time to rebuild their trust, but today was the first step. The change had begun, and he was determined to see it through. For the employees and for the future of FreshFields Market. After James Harper made the difficult decision to fire John Mitchell, a sense of uncertainty hung in the air. The employees had lived under the oppressive weight of John's leadership for so long that they found it hard to believe things could change overnight. But James was determined to make sure the store didn't just get rid of a toxic leader. It needed a fresh start. The store needed a new direction, and more importantly, it needed someone who could lead it with empathy, respect, and integrity. That person, James realized, was right in front of him. He had been watching Sarah Lawson, the assistant manager, for the entire time he'd been undercover, and there was one thing he knew for sure. She had the heart and the capability to turn this place around. "Sarah," James called to her as she stood by the counter, still processing the sudden firing of John. She turned toward him, her face a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. James could see the toll that the past few months had taken on her. She had been working tirelessly, often covering for missing staff, dealing with irate customers, and managing the daily chaos without ever being given the authority she deserved. James knew it was time for a change. "I want you to take over as the new store manager. You've been holding this place together already, and now it's time for you to lead it." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the weight of his words. She had spent so much time trying to survive under John's leadership that she hadn't even considered the possibility of being in charge herself. But as she looked into James's eyes, she could see the sincerity and trust in his words. I don't know if I can, Sarah said, her voice tinged with hesitation. I've been doing everything I can, but I'm not sure if I have what it takes to run this store by myself. James could hear the self-doubt in her voice, but he wasn't deterred. He had seen the strength in Sarah, even if she couldn't see it herself. You've already been doing the work, he said, his voice calm but firm. You've been managing the floor, covering shifts, keeping things running despite the chaos. Now, I'm giving you the authority to lead. You have my full support, Sarah. This store needs you. The employees need you. Sarah stood still for a moment, the weight of the responsibility sinking in. She had always been the one to pick up the slack, to shoulder the burden when things went wrong, but now she would be in charge. The thought was overwhelming. She had spent so many years under John's oppressive leadership, where every decision seemed to be scrutinized and criticized. The idea of actually leading a store, making decisions that would affect the lives of her colleagues and the success of the business, was both exciting and terrifying. But as she looked around at the employees, many of whom had been with the company for years, she realized she couldn't back down. They deserved better, and she had to be the one to show them that things could change. I promise you, I'll do my best, Sarah said, finally finding her voice. I want to make this place a better work environment for everyone. I won't let you down. James smiled, relieved to hear her confidence begin to emerge. I know you won't, he said, nodding approvingly. And remember, I'm here to support you. You won't be alone in this. We're going to rebuild this store together, step by step. But the first step starts with you. You're the one who has the power to change things. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the opportunity slip by. The store, her colleagues, and herself deserved better, and she was going to lead them to that better future. The transition would not be easy. Sarah knew that taking on this new role came with immense responsibility. She had witnessed firsthand the toxic atmosphere that had plagued the store, the fear that had taken root in the hearts of the employees, and the resentment that had built up over time. But as she stepped into her new role, she also understood that it was an opportunity to create something new. The work environment could be transformed from one of fear to one of collaboration, respect, and teamwork. She would work with the employees to rebuild the store's culture from the ground up. James's trust in her was the first step, but now it was up to her to take that trust and turn it into meaningful change. James assured Sarah that he would be there to help every step of the way. He promised that the corporate team would back her up and that she would have all the resources she needed to succeed. I'll be checking in with you regularly, James said. But don't feel like you have to do this alone. You have a team here, and together we can fix what's broken. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of her new role, but also a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a real chance to make a difference. And as she looked at her co-workers, she saw that they were watching her, waiting for her leadership. They had been waiting for someone to step up, to show them that things could be better. Sarah knew it was time to lead, to be the person they needed her to be. That afternoon, after the decision had been made and the announcement had been made, Sarah walked into the break room to meet her team. She could feel the eyes of the employees on her, their skepticism and hope hanging in the air. I know things have been tough around here, she began, her voice steady but warm. But I'm here to make sure we turn this store around. I know we've all been through a lot, and I know many of you have felt unheard, unsupported, and undervalued. That ends now. I'm committed to making this a place where we all can work together, where we can respect each other, and where we can make sure that every customer who walks through these doors feels valued. The employees looked at her in silence for a moment, and then slowly, one by one, they began to nod. Sarah could see the change in their expressions, the hope that had been reignited in them. They had been waiting for someone to lead them, to show them that things could improve, and now that leader was standing in front of them. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a surge of confidence. This was her time. She wasn't just going to manage the store, she was going to rebuild it, alongside her team, with James's full support behind her. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had the power to make it happen. The future of FreshFields Market and the well-being of her colleagues was in her hands. James Harper stood at the front of the conference room, his eyes sweeping over the group of district managers and key members of his corporate team. The time had come to address the state of the company, to lay out the vision for the future, and to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. The toxic culture that had plagued the store James had worked undercover in was just a symptom of a larger problem, one that extended far beyond just a single location. This issue was systemic, affecting the way employees were treated, the way customers were served, and the overall way the company was run. It was time for a major overhaul, and James knew that the changes had to come from the top down. "Today, we start a new chapter," James began, his voice calm but resolute. "The days of relying on numbers alone to measure success are over. We've seen firsthand how that approach has led to toxic work environments, low morale, and unsatisfactory service for our customers. From now on, we will measure success in a way that truly reflects what our company stands for: respect, fairness, and integrity." James paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. The room was silent, the weight of his message clear. He knew that some of the managers were skeptical. After all, the old ways had worked for so long. But James was unwavering. "We will implement a new evaluation system that goes beyond just sales numbers. We will be evaluating employee satisfaction, leadership quality, and customer feedback. These factors will now be just as important as the bottom line." The new evaluation system wasn't just a change in how performance would be measured, it was a fundamental shift in the company's priorities. James had come to realize that it wasn't enough to simply focus on profits and growth. A company was nothing without its employees and customers. The well-being of the people who worked there and the people who walked through the doors were the foundation of any successful business. James knew that if FreshFields Market was going to thrive in the future, it had to create a culture where employees felt valued and customers felt respected. This new evaluation system would hold everyone accountable, not just for their numbers, but for how they treated each other and their customers. "Starting today," James continued, his tone more serious, "we will also be implementing unannounced visits to each store. I will be visiting every single one of our locations, not as the CEO, but as a customer. I want to see firsthand how things are being run and, most importantly, how our employees are being treated. This is not about catching people doing things wrong. It's about understanding what's working and what needs to change. I expect full transparency and honesty from every single store." There were murmurs of surprise around the room. Unannounced visits were a bold move, but James was determined to show that change would be more than just a corporate initiative. It would be a culture of continuous improvement and accountability. James wasn't done yet. He had one more major announcement to make. "We will also be implementing anonymous employee surveys," he said, his eyes locking with each manager in turn. "I want to hear directly from the people on the front lines, the cashiers, the stock clerks, the floor staff, about their experiences. No one should ever feel like they have to hide their opinions out of fear of retaliation. These surveys will be confidential, and they will play a major role in shaping the future of this company. I want to know what we're doing right and where we need to improve. And most importantly, I want our employees to feel heard." The room was quieter now, the gravity of James's words sinking in. This wasn't just about changing policies. This was about transforming the company's entire culture. James had seen what it was like when employees were afraid to speak up, when they were too afraid to share their thoughts because they feared being punished. He was determined to make sure that never happened again. From this point forward, the company's culture would be rooted in respect, fairness, and the idea that every employee mattered. No longer would people be silenced by fear or favoritism. James wasn't just promising change, he was ensuring it would happen. "Lastly," James added, his voice taking on a softer tone, We are going to focus on the well-being of our employees, not just their performance. I want to create an environment where people are excited to come to work, where they feel supported and respected. That means giving people the time they need to rest, offering opportunities for growth and development, and making sure that everyone feels like they have a voice. Our employees are the heart of this company, and it's time we started treating them that way. As James finished speaking, he could see the room beginning to shift. The managers, who had once been skeptical, now looked engaged, thoughtful. The corporate culture was about to undergo a radical change, and it wasn't going to be easy. But James was ready to lead the charge. The old way of doing things was over. From now on, the company's focus would be on creating a supportive, positive work environment, one where respect and fairness were at the forefront. The first steps had been taken, and the company-wide changes were just beginning. But James knew that as long as he stayed true to his vision, and as long as the managers and employees continued to embrace these changes, FreshFields Market would become a company where both employees and customers felt valued. And that, James knew, was the key to long-term success. Thank you for joining us here at Deep Inside HQ. If you've enjoyed the journey into the world of undercover CEOs, behind-the-scenes business revelations, and real stories of transformation, don't miss out on what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss an episode. Be sure to turn on notifications and share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on the stories we've shared. Join our community and let's dive deep together into the untold stories that shape the world of business. Your voice matters, and we're excited to have you along for the ride.